Are you ready to perform at your highest potential? Welcome to the Performance Matters podcast from GP Strategies, your talent transformation partner. In each episode, we'll interview industry experts and explore best practices and innovative insights to help your organization improve performance. Hi, it's Michael Teal, host of the Performance Matters podcast, with you once again. Today, we're talking about the AI dilemma. The notions of trust, transparency, and leadership. How do they impact AI and an organization's effectiveness? Looking forward to this conversation. I'm not here alone. I'm pleased to be joined in the virtual studio by Leah Clark, practice lead for the leadership division at GP Strategies, one of the many talent transformation services on offer here at GP. Now, for those that haven't met Leah yet, she is a longtime friend of the show. I encourage you to go back and check out our archives. But a little bit about Leah. She comes to the podcast with a nearly 25-year background in leadership and coaching development, getting her start in the financial services industry. Now, Leah is formally trained as an organizational psychologist, where she did her master's work at Columbia University. She and her team also maintain a very active pulse on the rapidly developing dynamic between leadership coaching and AI. Leah, I'm honored to have you back to the show. Welcome.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here. We always have some great conversations, so good to be back with you.
Well, I truly am the beneficiary of your wisdom and insight, and I understand from our pre-production communications, you and your team have been pretty busy on a study called Steering the AI Revolution. And I'd like you to just share a little bit about the study before we dive into it. Tell us about what prompted it and just a little bit about the background and data due diligence, I guess you could say.
I'm really excited about the work that the team and I have done. What we did was a survey of both leaders and individual contributors from across the globe, with the intent of really digging into leader readiness to support a transformative generative AI strategy, and what individual contributors think of their leader readiness. So the goal of the research was to say, are folks enthusiastic about AI? Are they using it? Do they feel as though their leaders understand and grasp the magnitude of what's happening with AI? And maybe most importantly, how can we learn from the insights of those leaders and those individual contributors what we need to do to make sure that we are leading a transformative AI effort that includes both the technology, but also the human beings. So we essentially asked the human beings.
Well, it sounds like we've got a lot to talk about. There's no doubt about it. And as someone who is in this AI world, like I guess everyone really at the thick of it, I want to ask you probably the most simple, highest level question I can think of here, Leah. And that is, from the research, are people actually using AI at work?
I was surprised at just how much they are using it at work, because I don't think any of us are surprised about the fact that AI, and generative AI specifically, has really been something that we're all way more aware of. We access more than we did, even just 2 short years ago. And that's in large part because of the rise of things like ChatGPT. So it's no surprise that generative AI has become a tool that people are excited about. And we know that it's been around in personal use, Netflix, social media, other things that we have in our home lives. However, the key issue that we wanted to understand was, are you using it at work? Has it started to make its way into the day-to-day activities that you take on in your organization? Whether that organization knows it or not, are you using AI? And what we found was that 88% of both individual contributors and leaders said, yeah, I'm using it at work. So a large proportion of both populations are more than dabbling in the use of AI at work. And you know what, Michael? What I found even more interesting than just the usage was we said, okay, you're using it. We got that. Do you see its potential to transform? And again, pretty significant numbers. 80% actually said, yes, we believe that AI has the power to transform. Now we clicked down a little bit more on that and said, okay, transform for the better or the worse. And I would say that by and large, the majority of those we surveyed see the power of AI to positively transform the workforce. So words like excited and innovation and useful, those were what bubbled to the top of the list when we asked folks to express their sentiment. So, yes, they're using it. They're using it at work. They're excited about its ability to transform, and they believe that that transformation will be for the better.
To me, that sounds very exciting in terms of both the contributor and the manager is seeing the opportunity. So, I guess the other question I would have that follows that would be from what you're seeing, then, is that initial fear that we were seeing a few years ago of saying, am I turning into a blacksmith? No offense if you're a blacksmith out there and you're listening to this. But tell me about that. What's the sentiment of fear right now? Is that falling away? Is it receding?
Yeah, I think we've seen a transformation or a move, I would say, from more fear and anxiety being expressed at even the beginning of 2024. Words like anxious, nervous, that's what I heard more often just at the beginning of last year. And yet, over the course of 6 months, 12 months, there was a shift already in the conversations we were having with clients and in the data we were looking at where folks were moving from less of an anxiety and fear based perspective and stepping closer to something more positive, getting more energy and excitement about generative AI. Now, I want to be really clear. It doesn't mean that their anxiety was completely wiped away. So I'm not here to tell you we've declared victory, the technology and the bots and the humans are all living in harmony and nobody's worried about their job, right? That's simply not true. There is still some anxiety, but it's not as high as it was even just a few short months ago. And I can share with you that in the data that we looked at, there is still some concern about job elimination. We saw that 38% of individual contributors and 42% of leaders have some worry that AI could eliminate their jobs. And 82 and 85% said that there are ethical concerns, which was really fascinating to me because that's a really decent number of the population who's talking about it, who gets the fact that this is a powerful tool. And I'm a little bit worried about some of the things. I get some of the ethical concerns and implications. So, excitement for sure, still some anxiety about jobs being eliminated, but certainly less than I had seen previously. And maybe not a concern, but an awareness, I'll call it, for some of the ethical implications for sure.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I was actually having dinner with a couple of colleagues. I work more in the learning services side of things. And we were just discussing our own personal perspectives on what we're using AI for, what we're not, what works, what doesn't. And I heard two times a very similar sentiment about this ethical consideration of, wow, I can tell I've asked somebody for a deliverable and I've opened it up and I can immediately tell it was an AI product. To me, that's potentially a career red flag for somebody if it's not disclosed right. I guess what I'm saying is I will validate that. I'm feeling that too, just from the line level from individuals.
Something really important, I think, in what you called out when you talked about being aware of AI use in that example and it being a red flag. You added a phrase, if it's not disclosed. And that is so important. So I wanted to just highlight the importance of that, right? It's not necessarily a red flag that AI was used. I advocate for being transparent and encouraging AI use as long as your organization allows for that within its guidelines and parameters. And so it might be a red flag if you're not using it because it certainly has the opportunity to make life easier, faster, more efficient. However, there does require that aspect of disclosure. So you're touching on an ethical consideration for sure. And if AI is used without the benefit of human thinking and human intervention, then I would say that that's a red flag. But I think what you're touching up against here is how these ethical considerations and these ethical conversations, A, they're happening across the dinner table or in our personal lives, and B, that they are multi layered, right? There are different layers to use AI. Is it okay? Is it not okay? Is it not okay if I'm not using it because maybe I'm not embracing the technology? So there's no easy answer, but I think there are important conversations to be had. And that's a big part of what we're encouraging leaders and individual contributors to do is have these conversations about usage, about ethical issues.
I just want to double back here on this concern about job elimination. What I heard you say there, Leah, is that many individuals working with or using it, it's fast becoming a piece of their daily life and there's excitement. But you also had said there was a fairly large majority of individuals that are having concerns about job elimination. So I'd like you to just talk a little bit more about that.
So, what we saw in the numbers around job elimination, and it is a trend or a theme that continues across different aspects of the research, is that there is a portion of the population, in this case 38%, that still worries about job elimination. And then what we saw was another about third of the population that said, I just don't know. I don't know if my job is going to be eliminated. And then another third, roughly speaking, that said, I don't worry about it. Now, the challenges for leaders, the challenge before leaders is to, first of all, be honest with both the group that's worried about job elimination and the group that doesn't know and not overpromise, right? Leaders can't promise that jobs aren't going to be eliminated or reshaped. So I would never suggest to a leader, just tell them it'll be fine. That would be bad coaching and that would be poor leadership in the face of what we all can see is going to be dramatic change. But it's also dramatic change about which we still have a lot of questions, right? Questions about, well, what technology are we going to use? And exactly which jobs will it eliminate or reshape? And so the concern is there, both those who are worried and those who say, I don't know. Leaders can't promise that things are going to change, and things are murky at best in terms of the technology, so they themselves don't know. So, where does this leave leaders? What is a leader to do for someone who is worried about this? Well, it's what they can do when there's any uncertainty, when there's any transformative change. And that is to acknowledge the concerns, first of all, give people the space to express their worries, to share the emotions that they're having, and to acknowledge what it is that people are worried about. And then give them the space to engage in conversation about it. What are you worried about? What do you notice? What do you see? And in return, as a leader, share what you know. What are you aware of with respect to AI adoption in the organization? What are you noticing with respect to the industry? And what do you think might happen with respect to those jobs being reshaped? So, in other words, share what you know when you know it. You cannot tell people that jobs will be exactly the way they are right now, but you can give them the space to express their emotions, give them the opportunity to engage in a dialogue about it, and as a leader, share what you know when you know it. And if you can do those things, then you're doing the best you can in a world that is incredibly fast moving and uncertain, which essentially describes the technology as much as it does our world right now.
That is sage advice there, Leah. Now, in terms of the overall report itself, so thank you for indulging me and diving into that topic of jobs and what a leader can do there. But from your overall perspective on the report, which I know was fairly exhaustive, from a leadership perspective, then, What's the biggest ahas or takeaways that you had from your report?
What I took away from it, the first part was not as much of an aha as an endorsement of what I think is incredibly important. And that was that what we saw from individual contributors and leaders was a resounding endorsement of the role the leader plays in the implementation of a successful AI initiative. So both individual contributors and leaders alike said, yes, leaders are important if this is going to go well. Now, what surprised us was the lack of confidence or the dip in confidence, I'll say, that those leaders are in fact ready or equipped to successfully lead the Gen AI initiatives within their organization. So we heard they're really important. And I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that they are knowledgeable. I'm not so sure they're thinking through the impact. I'm not sure they have the technical skills. And I'm not sure they really have a plan around upskilling and reskilling. And what was also really interesting about the data, and I referenced this earlier, was that there was a decent cross section, about 30% or so, give or take across the different dimensions, that fell into this neutral category. So again, I'm speaking rough numbers. You can see the exact data in the report, but about a third who had confidence in leaders across multiple dimensions, about a third that did not have confidence, and then a pretty big proportion in the middle there that said, I just don't know. I am not sure. And so for me, Michael, what that said was great. Let's seize the momentum of that smaller population that has the confidence. We may not win the hearts and minds of those who don't think that their leaders are ready, but what if we could move that middle third and get them excited and enthusiastic about their leaders and give them confidence that their leaders are capable? Now we've got something going. Now we've got some momentum. So leaders are important. The confidence in them around generative AI is lukewarm. But if we could get the neutral population to move into a place of optimism, confidence, and positivity, then I think we will start to have some momentum in organizations behind leader and employee enthusiasm for embracing a technology and human world or team.
It almost sounds a lot like the technology adoption model, where you've got to get that critical mass. And then finally, the folks that have no confidence, which would be kind of the equivalent of the laggards in a technology adoption model, finally go, okay, I'm going to go along with it. I'm feeling confidence. I see where the organization is going on that end. That's pretty interesting. It sounds like there's also some layers of uncertainty. Is that fair to say, Leah?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing this in the data as well. And when we look at these different layers, we want to give our leaders a bit of a break, right? Because this is uncertain, fast moving, unprecedented technology. And so some of the confidence or lack of confidence that we're seeing may be attributable just to the fact that the technology is a bit unknown, it's untested, it's moving fast. It can do things that prior technology couldn't do, like learn and perform some tasks that typically we would have thought only human beings could do. And so that first layer, the technology and uncertainty about that, is likely impacting the lack of confidence that we're seeing in the data. I would say the second layer to that uncertainty is when we ask people, are leaders ready? Are you ready? Again, back to that fast moving technology, what does readiness even mean in this world of fast moving generative AI? How do I know whether or not my leaders have their arms around the implications, an upskilling or a reskilling plan? If they're knowledgeable today, will they be knowledgeable tomorrow? How technical do they have to be? So the technology is fast moving and uncertainty. And so, how we define or evaluate our confidence in our leaders' readiness can be equally as murky because we don't really know what readiness means in this, again, fast paced, uncertain world. And then Last but not least, and this is one that I think is maybe the most correctable from a leadership perspective, and that is communication. So, yes, the technology is uncertain, and yes, it's hard to define what readiness means. But there's also an aspect of this that is whether or not leaders are communicating what it is that they are doing or not doing, what they know or don't know. So they might very well have an AI plan and a strategy. They might be really shoring up their technical skills, but if they're not communicating that to their people, if they're not cascading that message down through the organization, then that uncertainty is going to persist. So perhaps the most fixable of those three layers is the communication aspect. And I think leaders need to do a better job of being transparent and frequent in their communication.
Sounds reassuring to me is this idea of if you don't have the answers, if you feel as a leader that you're a little left behind, am I hearing you say it's even okay on the communication to say, I don't know what the answer is. We're exploring 4 or 5 things. If you have some ideas, come to the table. Is that a fair sentiment for somebody who goes, wow, I feel like time has passed me by here? I mean, is that some advice that you would share?
Completely. And that's hard to do, especially if you're in a leadership role. It can be vulnerable to say, I don't know, I'm not sure. And it is one of the best ways to establish trust and authenticity and connection with your people is to be vulnerable. They know that there is a lot that's uncertain about AI. And so, as a leader, to pretend that you have the answers when you don't, they're going to suss that out. And so acknowledging that you don't know the answers is okay and is an opportunity for you to invite conversation with people on your team members about what they see, what they notice, perhaps what they're experimenting with. What we saw in the data was that people are not afraid to have these AI conversations. In fact, they want to talk about it. 85% of those we surveyed, both individual contributors and leaders, said that they're comfortable sharing their thoughts. And they're having conversations somewhat regularly. So 61% of leaders and 46% of individual contributors say that they're talking about AI with their leaders. When they have these conversations, I would say they feel they're being transparent ish, is the word I would use. It's a thin veil, but maybe I can see a little bit through it. But we asked them this. We said, when you have these AI conversations, do you feel as though your leader is being transparent in the information that they're sharing? Over half said yes, so that was good. About 25% were neutral. I'm not sure my leader is transparent about AI, and about 16 and 17% disagreed. So they're not afraid of it. They're having the conversations. There is transparency and some work to do there, and they want to have the conversations more. So 59% of individual contributors said, I want more, and 71% of leaders said they want it more. So this is, in my mind, really an open invitation that we're seeing in the numbers and we're hearing in the folks that we speak to engage, to talk about these issues with your team in a way that encourages transparency and fosters trust and honestly, ultimately innovation if you're using the tools and talking about what you see.
In terms of your biggest takeaways from the report, what would those be, Leah?
I would say what leaders can do specifically with respect to the issues we've been talking about today, the trust, the transparency, the communication, a few things. First of all, it's about creating that environment of psychological safety and growth mindset. So, encouraging in yourself as a leader and in others that sense of experimentation and failure, experimentation and learn, making it okay to use AI and to admit that you're using it. So, creating that safe space where folks can talk about what they're using, what they're noticing, the success and the failures. Because if we don't do that, then we're not going to learn not only what's possible, but we're not going to talk about those limitations. So, that environment of safety and growth mindset, number one. Number two, I would say provide access to the tools. So, folks want to be empowered to use the technology and encouraged to provide feedback when they do. So, creating that feedback mechanism, which was also a bit low in what we saw. I would say communicate at both the macro and the micro level. So share your vision and your plan, share what you know when you know it. And if you don't know it or you're still working on it, share that too. At the micro level, personally share what the potential impacts of the technology might be, both good and bad. And then I would say, last but not least, and these two go together, make sure that you're maintaining that connection to your people. I talk a lot about AI being a big brain that also needs the brains, and I'll say it at the risk of sounding a little soft here, needs the brain and the heart of your people, right? Their thinking, their energy, their passion, so that use of AI is an augmentation strategy and not a replacement strategy. So keeping that dialogue and involvement and communication open. If leaders can do that, then I think they are certainly really well positioned not only to embrace the technology, but to encourage their teams to do the same.
Leah, this report, is this something that is publicly available? How would somebody that is listening to this and they say, "Ooh, I want to dive into the data," how would they have a chance to get face to face with the data?
Yeah, so on the GP Strategies website, you can navigate to resources, download the full report, and there's a webinar where I reviewed the details of the report, an overview. So you have the opportunity to really do both. Go ahead and download the report at gpstrategies.com, listen to the webinar, and then excited to engage, in this conversation. It's such an important space for the success of AI to incorporate the leader and the human in the loop. So excited for folks to engage with us on this topic.
Leah, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today.
Thanks for having me.
The Performance Matters podcast is brought to you by GP Strategies. Together, we can create a world where business excellence makes possibilities achievable. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you get podcasts or listen on our website at gpstrategies.com.